ahead.
I'm especially pleased to introduce today's speaker. We've been living through a difficult era in our history. We've had the pandemic, so that is universal, but the state of affairs in America is ours. We have so many ways, we have become so many ways the divided states of America. Our democracy is being assaulted through unjust laws and raw violence. We've seen the effort to suppress voting, the battle between lies and facts, and anger and a grievance exploding violently in what happened in the iconic insurrection of our Capitol on January 6th. Fintan O'Toole is a columnist for the Irish Times and Leonard L. Milberg lecturer at Irish Letters at Princeton. He's a friendly outsider to the US and a renowned critic, which is why I'm so pleased to bring him here to the Schemel Forum today. What does the world think now of our country? Many of us feel that we are under a dark cloud under which lurks an uncivil war, an outright effort to turn our democracy into an autocracy. Americans against Americans. As 9/11 was shocking, and we still feel the shocks, the domestic terrorism today is even more dangerous. Fintan O'Toole knows that well, and we hope he can help us understand it. So please welcome him to the podium.
Hello, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with you, even incorporeally. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person and enjoy your famous hospitality, particularly. However, this is not a bad second, and I suppose one for me thing that is slightly interesting about speaking to you from Princeton in New Jersey, where I am at the moment, is that I came here first in 2012, and I was fascinated to discover, and not many people in Princeton really know this or are interested in it, but that the founder of Irish republicanism, the person we might think of as the sort of George Washington of Ireland, Theobald Wolfe Tone, the great revolutionary of the late 18th century, actually spent 2 years in Princeton, and he was here because he'd been arrested by the British, and his family were quite well connected, and they got a deal done basically where he would not be executed so long as he would flee to America and not come back, and he ended up in Princeton, and there's just a couple of letters of his which are very moving and very powerful reminders of how glorious the new American Republic could seem to an outsider like Tone, an Irish outsider coming to this country at that time. He was immensely happy in America, and you know, not he had a young family, he had his wife, he had his children, he had a small farm just outside Princeton, but what he was happy about was being a free citizen. You know, he had that. One of his letters, he says, "It's absolutely incredible. All public taxation goes for the public good." It's amazing, you know, just that idea that there isn't a monarch, there isn't a monster up there somewhere sucking all your resources and using it for themselves. It's of course he broke his word. He when the revolution broke out in Ireland, when the French were about to invade, he went back, and of course he subsequently died, and his children remained in Princeton, and his wife. But it was moving to me to read that, both you know, as a sort of tribute to the American Republic of the time, and also the sense of how influential it was. I mean, how much hope it gave to people in other societies about the possibility of this new kind of experiment in democracy, and what it might mean, and what it might mean not just for systems or institutions, but for people's lives. You know, the possibility of living as a connected citizen with other citizens. It lit a certain kind of hope that obviously had huge consequences for an awful lot of people, even when those consequences turned out to be hopes that were dashed, as in the Irish case. I was just thinking then of a quote from Abraham Lincoln, which was 40 years after Tone died. So by the time that the American Republic was really kind of settling down, this was Lincoln's first great speech in 1838. And I suppose it was at a time when the new republic had seen off foreign challenges, right? So it had seen off the British effectively. The War of 1812, it was kind of settling down. And the thing that was becoming clear was that this was a new kind of country, not just for its institutions, but also for the nature of the threat it faced. So pretty much every country historically had faced threats from their neighbors. That was the fundamental fear was we're going to be invaded by the people next door. And so the sense of fear was very much outwardly directed. And Lincoln was reflecting in 1838 that this was not the way America was, that actually it was in a kind of very new historical position, which was there was no credible threat from the outside. In ecological terms, we might say it had no natural predators. Mexico was unlikely to, overthrow the United States Republic. Canada certainly wasn't going to do it. The British couldn't do it. So this is what Lincoln was reflecting. He said, at what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it is ever to reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction is to be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. And it's a very potent, of course, Lincoln's use of language is still so wonderful. So it's a very potent formulation. But it's also, I think, very interesting for a warning against complacency, a warning against this almost unique American temptation to say, we're safe, our democracy is safe. What Lincoln was saying was, well, yes, it may be safe from the outside, but that does not make it safe from internal threat. It must look to itself for where danger might come from. And of course, that became very obviously true in Lincoln's own lifetime and career with the Civil War, with secession. But looking at the United States from the outside as a friendly observer, as someone who's spent a lot of time in this country, but my roots and my home are very much in Ireland. The thing that strikes you, I think, most immediately from the outside is America's succumbing to that temptation that Lincoln warned about. That perhaps because of its exceptional position as a world power, it has developed, or certainly until recently, a certain idea of where threat to its democracy might come from. And it has perhaps failed to anticipate the fragility of its democratic culture, with consequences that I think we're living through right now. I'm going to suggest, if I may, over the next 6 hours or so, no, I'm only kidding, just 5 particular challenges that I think it seems to me American democracy faces. There may well be others, and I'm sure some people will think it's a bit of a liberty being taken by an outsider in pointing these things out. But some of these are not unique to the United States. Some of them I think are very specific. But I think the combination of them perhaps is what might help us to define the present crisis. the first particular challenge is that the American Constitution in its time was such an extraordinary and inspiring document that we find it difficult to think of it as other than a sacred text. So it's unquestionable that when that great document was framed, it was not just a brilliant political construct for the creation of the United States, but also contains some very, very fundamental statements about the human condition and about how human beings can interact freely with each other. However, it is an 18th century text. And I think a very particular thing happened in the United States, which is that one of the constitutive aspects of the creation of America that we sort of take for granted, although perhaps shouldn't, is increasingly threatened, one might say, but was the separation of church and state. It's hard for us to get our heads around how radical that was. How a society which had its roots in Europe, was breaking away from the European norms. And European norms were that whatever the religion of the ruler was, that was going to be the religion of the people. And of course, Ireland was an exception to that, and that created an extraordinary violence and trouble, which in some ways has continued to this day. But the Jeffersonian idea that you were facing in America religious plurality, and that therefore nobody could be free if there was a state church, it seems to me to be one of the most radical and admirable and important statements of the US. This was not an anti-religious statement; on the contrary, it was a guarantor of religious freedom. But I think one of the things that happened as a result of it was that there was a tendency to look differently at the Constitution. The Constitution was an unusual document. It was a new kind of document, but it was also a document for a society which was taking religion out of the state. And I think there's a natural tendency, therefore, to almost put religion back into the state, to make the Constitution itself a kind of quasi-religious document, and to see it as if it were Holy Writ, rather than what it is, which is a historical and political construct from a very specific time. And this way of thinking about the Constitution, I think, from an outsider's point of view, looks very problematic, right? And it's not abstract, right? One of the very, very striking things about the American Constitution, from my point of view as an Irishman, is just how hard it is to change it. Most liberal democratic constitutions which have developed from the 20th century, particularly a lot of them kind of developed after the Second World War, many of them ironically under American tutelage. So the German Constitution, for example, or the Japanese Constitution, which were very much kind of framed with American support and American help and American advice. These constitutions are much easier to change. It's much easier to see them as frameworks, absolutely, very, very important foundational frameworks of the state, but also ones that can adapt to change and to changing circumstances. With not with ease. I would argue that no constitution should be easy to change, because that obviates its power as a bulwark and as a guarantor of certain ways of understanding how the state works. But it does mean that there has to be some balance between the Constitution as bulwark and the Constitution as a document which is capable of adapting and changing. And I would say perhaps one of the great tensions in the American system is that because the ways of changing the Constitution itself are so very, very difficult, it means that the Supreme Court becomes perhaps arguably an overly powerful arbiter. So the only way to change the Constitution effectively is for the Supreme Court to find, well, actually, there are things in the Constitution that were not written down, these unenumerated rights. And it becomes a difficult business because you don't have a process of public engagement and democratic engagement in the changing of the Constitution. Just to give you a simple example of what I mean, my own country, Ireland, has dealt with two very, very difficult questions in recent years. One was abortion, which is, famously difficult and emotive. And the other is same-sex marriage. And for a Catholic country dealing with these two things, very, very difficult. But they were dealt with by public vote. Why? Because they have constitutional implications. The Constitution has to be changed in order to allow same-sex marriage, and it had to be changed to remove a ban on abortion. So you could say, well, that's kind of crazy. Who would have a public vote on these things? But we did, and it's a remarkably inspiring democratic process, right? Where everybody gets a vote, everybody gets a say, everybody gets to deliberate and think about what, as a society, do we want to say about these things. And in the Irish case, actually, these things turned out to be less divisive than people thought. So both liberalizing of the abortion laws and same-sex marriage were both introduced in Ireland in over the last 7 or 8 years through public vote, but also through a vote that was in both cases 2-1. Right. So you've got a consensus of at least 2/3 of the society can emerge through a process of constitutional change. And I think the United States lacks that. And I think that creates a lot of these tensions where the process of actually adapting the Constitution to social, political, cultural change is very, very difficult. But also institutional change. Some aspects of American political institutions seem quite breathtaking from an outsider's point of view. It's very, very difficult to understand how the Senate can operate with a system which is so completely out of proportion to the public vote. This is not just as a current problem, but as a problem that we know is going to get more and more pronounced into the future, where it's clear that the disproportion between the popular vote and senatorial representation is going to get worse. What's the system for changing that? Is there one? Is there a possibility of changing it at all? The Electoral College, similarly from the outside, looks very strange. I mean, how is it possible for someone to win the popular vote and not become president? It's hugely problematic. The second set of challenges, which I think are related really to I suppose concepts or ways of thinking that are sort of fairly deeply embedded in American history. And there's sort of two related concepts around, I would say, time and space. Right? So there's a tendency deeply rooted in American political history to think about democracy as a sort of linear process, right? So it moves forward in time. It gets better all the time, and it's sort of when achievements have been secured, they will be just built on. And this is not at all an irrational way of thinking about things, because broadly speaking, if we look at it, it's true. Clearly, the process of American democracy has been one of expansion, with voting rights, being extended beyond property holders, being extended to universal male suffrage, being extended to women. New immigrant groups, of course, coming in and becoming part of this democracy, and eventually, of course, very painfully, and some might say in an unfinished way, being extended to the African American population. So I'm not saying that there's not a logic or a reasonable way of thinking about American democracy as a sort of linear process of progress. However, I think that way of thinking about it is one of the reasons why recent events have been so shocking. If you think about democracy as a sort of inevitable progress from one state to the other, and not, and the next state being better than the previous one, how do you end up with the insurrection? How do you end up with what looks from the outside like a pretty organized attempt at a coup? How do you end up with things like voting rights, for example, being rolled back when it seemed that they had been achieved? So perhaps there's a sort of misplaced optimism in this notion that democratic progress is inevitable, which maybe creates a certain kind of complacency about the fragility of democracy. Democracy everywhere, not just in America, but one of the things we know historically is that democracy is reversible, that republics, most of the republics that have existed historically have had limited time spans, that they face enormous challenges, external in many cases. In the case of the United States, not so much, but it's a hard system to maintain. It takes work, and in particular, it takes actually a certain kind of pessimism. It takes a sort of vigilance. Right? The famous statement that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Is in a way a kind of pessimistic statement. It says if you don't pay attention, this system will destroy itself. And I think the sort of linear idea of progress is a way of not paying attention. And it's related, I think, in particular then for the United States so that's a kind of a temporal problem, and there's also a spatial problem, right? Which is, and again, it's rooted in history. It's not irrational at all, but for a very long time, and for some of us, at least most of our lifetimes, was the Cold War period, in which there was this idea that there was a democratic world and an undemocratic world, and this concept of the free world, which was so powerful. It suggested in a way that democracy was an aspect of geography, that it belonged to the part of the world in which we were. And of course, there was a huge amount of truth in this, but it also, I think, is distorting as a way of thinking about democracy, because the reality, of course, is that democracy, can and has thrived in all sorts of different contexts, very different parts of the world. But also that a crisis of democracy, which is, I think, what we're seeing now, can be global. Arguably, one of the characteristic things about our current moment is that we're seeing for the first time a kind of global crisis of democracy. We've had democratic setbacks in this or that country. We're seeing a very profound one now, which is not spatially limited. Right? It's a crisis of democracy in India. There's a crisis in Hungary. There's a crisis in the United States. There's a crisis arguably in Britain. There are very many different kinds of societies experiencing this crisis at the same time. And so it also, I think, challenges the idea of a kind of an American exceptionalism, and the idea that emerged at the end of the Cold War of a kind of triumphalism, that democracy had triumphed. And in particular, an American form of liberal democracy had triumphed. And that was the end of the story. Sadly, it's not. So that sort of, both that temporal idea of a kind of linear progress in time and the spatial idea of the free world, I think, have both kind of contributed to a misplaced complacency about American democracy. The third particular problem is, I suppose, summed up in that great slogan, "A pluribus unum," one from the many. It's a absolutely crucial democratic and Republican principle, and it's very much part of the DNA of American democracy. We were talking about the idea of the freedom of religion, which was so central. is a way of saying that you can transcend religious difference, which after all was probably the single most important intellectual difference. I mean, obviously, race was the single most important economic and human difference in terms of oppression. But in terms of the intellectual arguments that were going on, it was that kind of arguments between and within Protestantism and Catholicism were kind of so central to Western history. So the American ideal of how do you create a single thing out of diversity without crushing the diversity, right? So this huge challenge is not about homogenization, and it never was. This is, I think, something that's sometimes forgotten. I would argue, looking at American history, that this great achievements is exactly that, right? Which is to say, no, we're not homogenizing. We're not having a state religion. That itself was such a huge thing to do, to say, actually, we recognize diversity as a human value, not as a problem, but as one of the great strengths of this society, that it can contain people who think and worship very differently, and they can all be Americans. Now, however, of course, that was relatively easy in the 18th century, when you were creating a democracy that was dominated by English-speaking, white, property-owning men who, broadly speaking, shared a heritage in the British Isles. So the diversity was limited in that sense, but of course has been in a way the original sin, right? So the great contradictions of who is excluded from this democracy, who is outside it, and this challenge then of how do you conceive of a democracy which is pluralistic, but at the same time capable of being one. What does the oneness mean? If you imagine and sympathize with and understand the complexity of identities, which has arguably increased over time. Do you end up with a kind of balkanization of your democracy, where interest groups see themselves as being, in a sense, clients of the state who are seeking to maximize their own positions within it? Or is there a way to have a kind of unified sense of self, which is articulate and powerful enough to be capable of governing, but at the same time open and ambiguous enough to be capable of governing a very, very plural people? And of course, this is a difficulty which has in some ways exacerbated over time. It came to a head of course in the 1950s, 1960s with the civil rights movement, but it's a continuing question, because within a pluralist country, and coming from Ireland, I know all about this, right? The temptation of tribalism becomes very, very strong. All right. So if there are competing senses of us, who are we, then the us can very quickly become not them. One of the things that I'm very conscious of from the history of my own country is that, which has been shaped a lot by nationalism and ideas of national identity, is that actually all these ideas of nationalism depend on a notion of us and them. And the us part is really difficult, because no society, is actually homogenous. No society is actually, composed of people who are exactly the same. And therefore, it becomes a lot easier to say, well, actually, we know who we are. We're not those people. The negative definitions of identity become more and more tempting, as it were, when the pluralism of the society increases. And so the need for new narratives, new ways of saying, actually, who are we, becomes very urgent, I think. And it does seem to me that the United States has really struggled with that, right? Struggled with how do you create narratives of common purpose and common values, which are not susceptible to being taken apart and tribalized, and turned into this kind of what we see at the moment in the United States, which is this kind of polarization. The fourth obvious problem, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know in any of this, but is the incompatibility of extreme economic inequality with democracy. You know, it's the promise of democracy at its core is a simple promise that you matter as much as I do. I matter as much as you do. Each one of us has an equal voice as citizens. Citizenship is not divisible and it's not hierarchical. That's the great promise of equality, right, which is kind of written into the American Constitution and is so, of course, was so contradicted by slavery, but also so potent, you know, so potent as a promise. You know, and it's very striking, isn't it? In if you look at the great speeches of Martin Luther King, how much he was able to use the constitutional language, able to take the language of the 18th century, even knowing how much of a betrayal that language was for African Americans, but he could still use it really powerfully and very movingly and with great rhetorical force and power, to say, well, the promise may not have been delivered, but it's still the promise that's at the core of our vision of what a society ought to be. But it's also very striking if you look at King, that King was in some ways forced to confront the fact that equality could not simply be understood in racial or ethnic terms. It also had to be understood in economic terms. There had to be a sense in which people lived in the same society and at least, you know, shared the same burdens and shared the same benefits. And I think all of us are very aware that what we've seen, particularly over the last 20 years, you know, is a decoupling of economic growth from ordinary income and from the, you know, the lives and benefits and aspirations of most ordinary people. And I would suggest that becomes simply incompatible with democracy. And this is not just an American problem. Right? There's similar things that have been happening around a lot of the democratic world. But you can't reasonably say to somebody, you know, your vote matters as much as mine, when their daily experience is one that their interests don't matter, that actually they're not able to really fully participate and fully influence the public realm in the way that they ought to be. And of course, I think what is, however, very striking in the United States is the feedback loop. So it's not just that you get greater economic inequality, it's that greater economic inequality has been allowed to feed into greater and greater political influence, right? So the degree to which wealthy people and corporations can influence the political process directly, simply through the application of money, means that the kinds of policies which would actually address some of this inequality become more and more difficult to implement, because the political system is so obviously funded by people in whose interests that might not be. Again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know about this, but it is very striking that this is absolutely a common democratic problem across the democratic world, but it seems particularly problematic in the United States because of this feedback loop, that the people who benefit from economic inequality have an outsized influence in terms of shaping government policy, state policy, how politics works. And the last particular problem that I would suggest is what I would call the problem of pseudo-engagement. Right? So classical thinking about republics uh, was very much about saying that republics are not just sets of institutions, that they have to be rooted in the engagement of the citizenry. So thinkers about this throughout the centuries, have always said republics die when the citizens cease to be engaged. And that's always been a problem, right? It's always a difficulty, right? As to how do you engage the public in the thinking and acting in relation to the things that affect them politically. But I think we're in a new era where something new has happened, right? One always has to be wary about saying this is new, because historians can always say, well, no, it's not true. There's always previous examples of things. But I don't think there's ever been what we have now, which is not a problem of engagement, but a problem of what I call pseudo-engagement, right? Which is that social media have created an arena in which people can be extremely engaged. I mean, engaged every 2 minutes, if they want to be. A kind of a virtual public realm in which, people are continually interacting and continually sending out messages and expressing opinions and taking part in what might seem to be a broad discussion about all sorts of things under the sun, including, of course, politics. But it's an engagement which has been distorted, I think, into what social media companies call engagement, right? Which is that it's a value in itself if people are participating. The easiest way to get them to participate is through the outrageous, through the polarized, through the provocation. And therefore, you have a realm of apparent engagement, which actually thrives on a fundamental non-engagement, right? So again, we all know that what social media tend to do is to create groups of people who increasingly talk to each other and increasingly find their tribe, and instead of actually engaging in civic discourse, are engaged in either kind of reinforcing the positions they already hold, and if they reach out at all, it is in an abusive way, right? It's to stress how terrible the other lot are, and this, I think, is new, and it poses a very, very fundamental challenge to democracy. Again, this is one which is not specific to the United States, but the United States is a crucial core to it, right? Because, of course, the most powerful social media companies, like Facebook, for example, are American companies, and they're largely governed in America. There is no solution to the regulation of Facebook, to just take that as an example, which is not an American solution. Right? A country like Ireland isn't going to be able to regulate effectively what Facebook does. Probably even a country like Germany, which is currently trying, a big, powerful, rich country, probably isn't really going to be able to do it either, unless there's serious moves in the United States, I think, to think about what the costs of handing over this new public realm to private individuals whose main interest is in monetizing this kind of very corrupted idea of what engagement means. If we don't tackle that, I think the democratic problems are very obvious. So having successfully, I'm sure, depressed you over the last while, I'd like to finish on a positive note. So in spite of all of these things, I think it's really important to say that as an outsider, the thing that strikes me again and again and again is the human quality of care that one meets in the United States. There are still incredible numbers of people who care really deeply about political issues. who care really deeply about their communities and about their neighbors and about their societies. There's a kind of civic culture which did grow up in America, and I think is a legacy of the 18th century in a lot of ways. And I'm not romanticizing it. I'm not at all denying the tribalism or the divisions or the identity crises, but there's still a huge resource, I think, of willingness of people to take ownership of what's going on around them. The United States has produced some of the most wonderful, influential, and enlightening civic movements that the world has ever seen. You know, for someone, I'm 63, you know, and in my lifetime, growing up as a young person in Ireland, the inspiration of the civil rights movement was just so overwhelming. But also the inspiration of the feminist movement. You know, I would be a very different, and I think even worse person than I am today, were it not for the feminist movement coming primarily from the United States. You know, opening up new ways of thinking about identity, thinking about who we are, but also giving a voice to half of humanity. You know, it's pretty big stuff to begin to do. So I'm actually optimistic about American democratic culture. I was talking earlier on about the illusion of inevitable progress, but I think it's crucial at the moment that we also don't get into the opposite, right, which is an illusion of inevitable decline. There is nothing inevitable about the undermining of American democracy. What I think Americans have woken up to, and certainly what seems to me to be very personal from the outside, is that it's a democracy which has to be fought for. But we know from history that the prospect of danger that Lincoln was referring to concentrates the mind. Maybe as a species, we're inclined naturally to complacency. And it's only when we get a sense that the things that we value might be in danger that we really begin to engage and pay attention. Maybe we shouldn't be like that, but I think we are. In Joni Mitchell's words, we don't know what we've got till it's gone. But I would maybe slightly more optimistically say that we don't know how to preserve what we've got until there's a danger that it might be gone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can open it up to questions. If you have a question, you can either raise the emoji hand or signal to me that you have a question. Jack, do you have a question?
I want to congratulate you very much on your insights concerning the Supreme Court and the fact that that has taken on perhaps an oversized role in trying to change America that I don't think it was really intended to have. I think of the Obergefell decision on homosexual marriage, Roe versus Wade on abortion, even Brown versus Board of Education on race, were probably matters that should have been handled by constitutional amendment rather than a 5-4 vote of the Supreme Court that then imposes a particular practice for decades to come, whereas democracy on a more local level can experiment with those things, and by elections within 2 or 4 or 6 years can reverse course if necessary. Bringing it a little bit more up to date, you didn't mention recent presidential elections and the effect that they have had. In 2020, we witnessed an amazing situation where an incumbent president was running for re-election as a political outsider, and his opponent was the living, breathing, walking, talking epitome of the Washington, D.C. political establishment. And his election, we're seeing the consequences of that now. A man who spent virtually his entire adult life in Washington believes strongly in a powerful central government, is in conjunction with a narrow Democratic majority in Congress, using that to try to fundamentally change this country. We see it most dramatically and of great concern with his having virtually abolished the use of immigration, legitimate immigration policies. And he's thrown open the border of this country to virtually unlimited immigration with the, I think, cynical objective of bringing hundreds of thousands of future dreamers and voters for the Democratic Party to change America. I wonder if you could comment on that, and also the fact that so many issues that should be local or state increasingly become national. The school board issue right now, and the apparent attempt to use the Department of Justice to squelch parents locally trying to speak out on matters of legitimate concern to them. That Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, should be commenting or even using the force of the FBI against this. The move by big tech and social media to squelch conservative opinions. These are all matters that you might have touched on tangentially, but really not directly. I'd be greatly interested in hearing your views on them.
Thanks, Jack. You know, there's obviously a big range of issues there. You know, there's a genuine difficulty, right? Which is how do you, on the one side, guarantee the individual rights of every citizen, and on the other side, accept the diversity of local opinion and states, and you know, it's a genuine difficulty, and it's not one that's easily soluble, right? Because in an ideal world, local processes would always result in a respect for the human rights of every citizen and every individual equally, right? We know that in American history, of course, that hasn't happened, right? So huge numbers of people, you know, were deprived of the right to vote, even the most basic democratic rights. So you do need a powerful government to come in and say, actually, you know, we're constitutionally founded on certain kind of rights, and those rights have to be imposed from the center if they're not going to be respected. The balance, I think, is trying to construct systems of local engagement and local power that are genuinely inclusive, so that there really are voices for everybody, and feeding from the bottom upwards, I think, into that sense of equality, you know, and the protection of people's rights. But you know, it's this difficult, isn't it? That majorities in a democracy, majorities have to be able to get their will. But equally, in a Republican democracy, which I think America is and wants to be, a kind of key consideration is that majorities must not be allowed to override the rights of minorities, right? So how do you both respect the majority and limit it? Those questions are there all the time. You know, in terms of migration, you know, I'm a partisan in relation to that, because I'm a migrant, you know, and my people are migrants, and you know, vast numbers of people from Ireland settled in America and enjoyed the promise of American democracy over the centuries. And I'm, you know, I know enough about the 19th century, for example, to know that Catholic Irish migrants were characterized in very, very similar ways to the ways in which Hispanic migrants might be characterized now. There's a long history of seeing migrants as them, as others, as threats to American democracy. It was pretty standard thought in the 19th century that Catholics, could not be democratic citizens because they would just do what the priest and the Pope told them to do. Jewish people were characterized in similar ways as sort of ignorant and foreign. There's a long history of this, and actually, I just think we need to be very, very careful about thinking about migrants being brought in to change America. I mean, I would have thought the evidence is the other way around, actually, that America changes migrants. The extraordinary success of America is that, very, very quickly, people who migrate become Americans and become part of the society and become a huge asset to the society. So we probably fundamentally disagree, you and I, on all of that. But I think the larger issues are maybe one thing we might agree on is that there's a need for really very deep reflection as to where these balances struck in the American political system now. What is the balance between the local, the state, and the federal? Why is it? I think one thing we probably do agree on is that and we were coming at it from different perspectives, but I think we would agree that you have a problem if you're looking to your Supreme Court to make big social changes. I would completely agree with you. That's not where big social changes should be happening. They should be coming through a process of democratic deliberation. And so maybe one thing we might agree on is that, I do think there's a need for, and maybe it's over optimistic to think it's possible, but for a kind of bipartisan, genuine process of reflection on how the American system works and doesn't work. Because I think all of these problems are building up and up and up and becoming more partisan, more difficult. Groups who are in power feel that they have to rush things through because they might not get a chance again. Groups who are out of power feel that they don't recognize the legitimacy of elections. I mean, that stuff is very, very, very dangerous for democracy. I mean, democracy has to be based on the fact that if you're not getting your way, you still recognize that the process by which you're not getting your way was a legitimate one. And when more and more people on both sides don't recognize that, I think you have a very deep problem.
Thank you.
Sandra, did you have a question? You have to unmute. You have to unmute. And then after Sandra, we have a question in the chat. And
Okay, yeah, I'm unmuted.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm worried about the fact that there is an extreme situation here where a large minority of people use their opinion to erase reality, where the people who didn't want Biden to be the president pretend that he's not the president. Now, that's pretty scary when the scale of people, the number of people who believe that way is really dangerous. And I'm wondering if you think that, if you think that's as dangerous as some of us think it is.
I would very strongly agree with you, Sandra. Deliberative democracy has to be based on some respect for evidence. It has to be based on some sense that, okay, we may disagree about how we interpret the evidence,
yeah,
or what we think it means, or what we think how we should react to it. But if you lose a sort of core agreement about this is what is happening, you enter into a world of parallel universes, where well, that horrific phrase, alternative facts,
yeah, Yeah.
Once you have alternative facts, then actually democracy becomes impossible. You simply cannot have a democracy where people have a right to their own facts. You know, you have a right to your own opinions. You don't have a right to your own facts. And this, of course, is very much amplified by the social media world. You know, where you can construct this sort of universe of apparent engagement, whereby you just hear what you want to hear and it gets echoed back to you, and that's sort of exponential in the way that it grows.
And the party becomes a cult. You know, the party has become a cult instead of just a legitimate differing views from the other party.
Yes, and you know, you get, it becomes very personal, doesn't it? You know, because then if you believe that, say, for example, the election was stolen, well, the view itself is so extreme that it licensed extremism, right? So if the election really was stolen, that was a, you know, an absolutely appallingly outrageous act, you know, which then justifies greater extremism. So this is I think at the core of the problem. I mean, I'm not saying there are easy solutions to this, but what we've allowed to happen, and I use we in the very broad sense, you know, the Western world. I mean, the fact that we've handed over some of the most powerful means of communication and all our personal data to people who have really no accountability for how they use it. And you know, I spent most of my life as a journalist. Right? If I write something in my newspaper, I am personally liable for it. Right? You can sue me. You can challenge me. You can say, what, you know, why are you saying that? Where did you get those statistics from? You know, show me the trail of evidence that you're using to you know, argue for whatever you're arguing for. So I have legal accountability if I libel you, but I also have a kind of accountability to readers in general, right? Because, you know, quite reasonably people can ask me to show the trail of evidence. Why is that the case for newspapers, but it's not the case for these vast media companies? I mean, Facebook is they're media companies, you know, and the law that said that, you know, Facebook should be treated like the telephone company, you know, which means that it has no response. The telephone company isn't responsible for what you say on the phone. Facebook isn't responsible for what anybody says on Facebook. That, I think, is a really core problem, but also a soluble problem. I mean, it's a problem where you can say, well, actually, no, you are liable. You know, I mean, people who are making vast amounts of money out of this have a concomitant responsibility to be accountable for how their technology is being used. And you know, the United States government is powerful enough to actually impose that kind of obligation on people.
Well, you as a journalist are obliged to say what's true.
Yeah.
And that's why the free press is our ace in the hand. But it's important.
Yes. I mean, those basic values, you know, there's a reason why in the 18th century, the idea of democracy was very much tied up with the idea of a free press, you know. And it was simply that an informed citizenry is the basis of democracy, right? So it's not just the citizens have to be engaged, they have to be engaged in a way that they have access to information, and you know, and it's at every level. It's about policy, of course, but it's also very simply about corruption. You know, one of the things we know from every system in every country is that if you have unaccountable power, it will become corrupt. You know, and the job of journalism, I've always thought, the great Irish-American satirist Finlay Peter Dunne, Mr. Dooley, I don't know if anybody remembers that stuff, but it was a great 19th century column. But Mr. Dooley was the sort of barman who had all the wisdom, you know. But he said, well, the job of journalists, isn't it, is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. You know, and if we don't have that, if we don't have that commitment to the idea that journalism ultimately, and media, in the broader sense, has to be a public service. It's there to serve democracy. Then I think it weakens democracy itself hugely.
Yeah.
I see Maury has a question, and then Anthony.
Yeah. I recently read a very insightful review by you in the New York Review of Books on Afghanistan, in which I think it's fair to say that you were reasonably critical of America. Would you please comment on that and why you think America really fouled up?
Hi, Bori. Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for reading that piece. Yeah, I was trying to reflect on the tragedy, the absolute tragedy of Afghanistan, which is of course primarily a tragedy for the Afghan people who've now been left, under the sway of a really contemptible regime. Sandra was mentioning cults, but can you imagine being ruled by a cult, which doesn't believe that girls and women are entitled to basic education for a start, and so on and so on. We know, so this is a tragedy primarily for the Afghan people, but I think it's a tragedy rooted in this contradiction, right? Which was that America was trying to create a democracy in a very far away place that most Americans actually didn't know very much about. I'm not even sure that that's possible, even in the best of circumstances. But is it possible to create a democracy very far away when your own is in such trouble? So we were talking about accountability, and the vast amounts of American public money, people's money spent in Afghanistan with no accountability for what the strategy was, So the United States went into Afghanistan, it seems to me, in a completely legitimate way. Sandra mentioned 9/11, in her introduction, and I think it was completely legitimate to say these people harbored the terrorists who carried out that attack. They're refusing to hand them over. I think the United States, in self-defense, had a perfect right to overthrow that regime, right? But then it becomes a kind of classic case of mission creep, which is, we've overthrown that regime. What do we do next? And then, let's build a democracy, and let's have a war on drugs. Let's try and eliminate the poppy crop, so then we'll solve the heroin problem. And and it just kind of goes on and on and on and on. Now, some of these things in themselves were very admirable things to want to do, but there was no process in the American system undertaking this vast enterprise, of reflection, of criticism. We now know, because the Washington Post does a great service of publishing the Afghanistan papers, which are the internal documents, the internal interviews with people who were themselves involved, And these are generals, these are, high-level diplomats, these are, people who are making decisions in Afghanistan. And what you come across them saying over and over again is, we didn't know what we were doing. And it's sort of shocking, that it was all tactics and no strategy, and this kind of went on and on and on for 20 years, and it's a very poor reflection on the system of government, that there was no mechanism for saying, hold on a minute here, what are we trying to achieve here? How are we achieving it? What are the benchmarks by which we might judge our own success or failure? All of that was absent, So I see the tragedy of Afghanistan as itself a failure of American democracy, actually, because I don't think that could have been allowed to go on for 20 years in a democracy where those in power were really genuinely accountable to the citizens whose money they were spending.
Okay, Anthony, do you have a question?
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I was late, but I have certain technological issues. My comment first and then a question. I believe the purpose of government is to protect individual rights, and that pardon the word, it trumps democracy to some extent. I'm talking about the individual rights to life, liberty, and property. the government should protect us from murderers, kidnappers, and rapists. We should have the liberty to put a refrigerator on our front porch. In terms of property, that's also a property right. So my question is, what does the guest think of, what limits does he propose for government? What limits do you advocate? We can't vote on everything.
Sure. Well, you know, I suppose first of all, I'd say we maybe somewhat disagree. I think I agree with you, of course, about the protection of individual rights, but I think government has other functions as well, right? Which is, I mean, it seems to me that the most important thing that, well, our form of government, right? I mean, there's lots of different forms of government, right? And they would all say they protect individual rights. Most of them lie about that, but you know, they all will claim to do that. I think what's different about a Republican form of democracy is that it's based on a really important idea, which is that nobody should be dominated by anybody else, right? Including government, right? So that's the ideal, right? But it's not just that, you know, you've got government and a citizen, you've also got government should be able to step in and say, well, actually, you shouldn't be taken as a slave. Government should be able to step in and say, well, actually, it's not okay for men to oppress women. Government should be able to step in and say, well, actually, it's not okay for gay people or LGBT people to be treated with contempt. You know, so I think there's a wide range of protections that government needs to do. And it's that idea about domination. You know, freedom is not being dominated, you know, and I think government, you know, has to stop people being dominated. The difficulty then is what happens if government itself becomes too dominant, right? So this is maybe where you and I probably maybe have much more common ground, right? So the absolute key here is accountability. I mean, it's just, you know, you just go back to the very basic idea, which is we lend power to people who operate our institutions on our behalf. You're absolutely right. We can't vote on everything. We can't, you know, be making every decision every day collectively, right? So we delegate the power, right? And we know that in doing that, we're giving people power to potentially become dominant over us, right? To be corrupt, to be overly powerful, to impose their own interests over our interests.
Yeah, excuse me, because I don't want to take up too much more time, but could you give me some more concretes? For example, if you're working for my book company and I decide to fire you from the book company, do you have any recourse governmentally?
Well, yes, absolutely.
What would they be?
Labor rights, for example, you know, so government wouldn't, I don't think any government in the world would say you can't fire anybody, but I think they would say there are minimal standards, you know, which
would they be?
What would the minimal standards be? That you would have to, you would have to have either a good economic reason, right, which is the company is failing or we need to get rid of some people. That's perfectly legitimate. But what it would do is more negative, right? So you can't fire me because I'm gay. You can't fire me just because I'm a woman. You can't fire me just because you don't like my accent, you know? So what governments should do is kind of negative things, right? Saying there are certain kind of protections of individual rights, that somebody cannot be discriminated against in their employment, for example, just because of who they are. You should be able to fire me because I'm no good, you know, because I'm a pain in the ass, because you know, that's fine, you know. But you know, government absolutely has big roles in stopping me from being dominated on the basis of things that are not legitimate. I should not be dominated because of my race. I shouldn't be dominated because of my religion. I shouldn't be dominated because of my gender.
One more quick question. If I decide to hire you for less than minimum wage, is that okay? Because you're only worth $5 an hour to me as opposed to the minimum wage. Would you prohibit that for me hiring a poor Black person at that wage?
Yeah, I would prohibit you hiring anybody below minimum wage, because a minimum wage is an absolutely central aspect of human dignity, right? So what a minimum wage is, that there's, you know, people cannot live on less than a certain amount of money. They simply cannot in our societies.
How about them going out of business?
Well, tough. You know, if you're not capable of running a business that affords minimal dignity to your employees, then you're doing something wrong, right? You know, there's something that you should be able to do to be able to run a business that gives minimal dignity. And, you know, this is a basic democratic issue, because somebody cannot be a democratic citizen who is equal to you and able to make decisions and vote and think about stuff if they're living in brutal poverty. So if you're going to pay them $5 an hour, they're not going to be in a position to be able to have the kind of freedom, the kind of dignity, the kind of sense of self-worth that they need to be citizens in a democratic republic.
They might want to take the job, but I don't want to take up anyone else's time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Mary Karen, did you have a question? You'd have to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I have two things I want, really three things I want to say, I guess. The first is I need to claim my rights, my sense of identity, which means I'm a white Southerner whose roots were in working class folks. My mother washed dishes in a school cafeteria, and my father stacked beer cases before his job was automated in a brewery. So I come from white working class roots as an Southerner. And the reason that's important to me in terms of this discussion we're having right now is the United States, in my hometown that I grew up in, was segregated by law until I was 9 years old. And I can guarantee you that if it had been up to the city government and the county government to say that that's unacceptable, it wouldn't have happened. And so it's very clear to me that government has a role to play in ensuring that all of us who are considered citizens, which were the African-American people who lived in my community, have the right to vote, have the right to go to school, have the right to healthcare. And that's just really, really clear to me. And the other thing that is striking to me when we talk about governance and the separation of church and state is that the Ku Klux Klan had strong roots in religious ideology. And the last person was lynched in the United States in 1981. It was an African-American person lynched by followers of the Ku Klux Klan. You can find Klan literature and you will find that it's a Christian identity movement, and it's clear and they're explicit about it. That's the second thing, because I think that whole question of how religion interacts with government and citizenship is a significant one. And then the very last thing I want to say is just, in Kentucky, where I grew up as a child, no one would have ever asked the bishop of the diocese, I was raised as Catholic, what the bishop of the diocese thought about anything, because they didn't care. But they would have asked the head of the Southern Baptist Church in Louisville. When I got to Massachusetts and I was the Catholic chaplain at Harvard, it was just astonishing to me that both city, county, and state government cared what the Cardinal Archbishop thought about public political policy. And so what I think I'm trying to say is that I think government and religion are more intertwined than we recognize sometimes. But what the religion is that's dominant depends on where you are in this country, because this is a huge country geographically. And the dominant religious traditions in the American South are just not those in the big cities on the East Coast. They just aren't. So I think that question of the separation of church and state and how they weigh in together, and also that there's a role for government to guarantee the rights of citizens that the majority of their neighbors are not going to say should happen. The majority of my white neighbors would not have thought that it was a good thing for my Black neighbors. And I didn't even have Black neighbors because it was a segregated society. I lived in the white part of the community. So did everybody else who was white. So it was kind of astonishing to me when I discovered that healthcare was segregated by law. That's why Louisville General Hospital existed, because people of color Black people could not get medical care except in the Black hospital. So I don't know, it just always seems important to me that we be clear about our own history as a country when we talk about governance today, because it's not unrelated. It's just not, it's connected. And it is in the lives of lots of us. So that was my 2 cents worth.
Yes. Mary, you've articulated all that so brilliantly. I'm not going to repeat any of it. I accept to fully agree with you, and thank you so much for being so eloquent about it. I mean, the only thing I said is about church and state is, right, so just to be clear that I'm not sort of trying to be superior, as an Irish person, because my God, we know all about the realities of how toxic the intertwining of religion and politics can be. We've had a 30-year vicious conflict on the island between white Christians. This isn't even kind of people who are, ethnically incredibly diverse or religiously incredibly diverse, and this is actually, of course, nothing to do with religion in and of itself. It's to do with the capacity for religion to be used and exploited as a marker of difference. I think Sigmund Freud had that great phrase about the narcissism of small differences. And by God, we know all about that. But also, I grew up in a society in the Republic of Ireland, this is the main part of the island, which really was completely monocultural in its religious identity, and that gave the Catholic Church in particular, overwhelming power. And in the long run, that was terrible for the Catholic Church, because if people have too much power, it will be misused and it will be corrupting. And, one of the astonishing things I've watched over the last 10, 15 years is the extraordinary decline of the Catholic Church in Ireland, one of the most Catholic countries in the world, because power that's too arrogant, that's too fused, where you don't have, enough difference and enough sense of diversity, it becomes dangerous to other people, but also ultimately dangerous to itself. It will kind of destroy itself, because it's a bit like the way they're discovering that, we all as parents were told to kind of clean everything within an inch of its life with our kids. They're discovering actually it was a really bad idea, because kids need a certain amount of grit in order to develop immune systems, and I think the same is true of really all our identities, religious, political. If we don't have some grit in them, if we don't have the value of diversity, if we fuse different forms of power into single structures, then it's bound to be bad.
I have 2 questions in the chat, Fintan.
Sure.
Mike asks, who are other contemporary journalists or writers you look to for their insights?
Oh gosh, thanks, Mike. Sorry. Well, I was very influenced when I was a young person by American journalism, because I was lucky enough to be starting to think about journalism, at a time when you had that fantastic wave of what was called the new journalism in America, people like Tom Wolfe and that kind of. And my heroine has always been Joan Didion, who was one of those kind of American writers who emerged in the 1960s, one of the first people to be able to write at length factually based journalism. So a lot of research, a lot of evidence, it's not making stuff up, but to write it with the kind of clarity and artistry that a great novelist would bring to it, and I'm not for a single second comparing myself to Joan Didion, but in terms of inspirations, she's been hugely important for me. And I would I still have a huge admiration for old-fashioned journalism, investigative journalism, you know. Like we mentioned, for example, what the Washington Post did recently with the Afghanistan papers, right? That's real hard slog stuff. I don't know if anybody saw that project they did, but you know, it takes kind of hundreds and hundreds of freedom of information requests. It takes a long time of, you know, getting documents, and then it takes an amazing amount of work, you know, to actually analyze these documents, go through them, put them in a form that's accessible to the public, putting it out there so that everybody can you know, form their own conclusions about this kind of stuff. I thought that was a superb project. There's still great stuff going on, you know. There's been the recent the Pandora papers, old-fashioned muckraking, you know, where somebody gets a whistleblower who has access to a huge amount of information about what super rich people and corporations are doing to avoid taxes and to hide their money in offshore islands or jurisdictions. You know, just the sort of information stuff, you know, just actually feeding information into public consciousness remains such an absolutely crucial task. One of the difficulties is that a lot of this stuff was done by newspapers when newspapers were pretty wealthy, you know. I was lucky enough to come into journalism when, even in Ireland, kind of newspapers had a bit of money, you know, because everybody bought a newspaper. So, and newspapers were the main beneficiary of advertising, you know, they got lots of ads. So it meant that a newspaper could afford to say, well, Fintan, you go off and spend 6 months, you know, looking at corruption in the beef industry, and come back to us when you've kind of found something, right? You know, and you know, when you can write this and you've stood it up. Whereas now it's just increasingly difficult, you know, for these institutions to be able to say, take the time, you know, have the resources to really investigate and dig into stuff, you know, and so I think that's one of the difficulties. And again, one of the reasons why we need maybe new kinds of institutions. Increasingly, it has been happening that kind of foundations have been kind of setting up independent systems for funding and supporting that kind of investigative journalism. And I think we'll see more and more of that, because again, it goes back to the basic ideas of accountability. If governments and power operate in the dark and people aren't accountable for what they're doing, it's pretty inevitably going to be bad.
Okay, and then we just have one more in the chat before we go. Paula would like to know what you think we should do to save our democratic country.
So I suppose going back to my 5 problems, you know, I think the first thing has possibly been done, right, which is I think the end of complacency. Right? So the wake-up call, I think, has been received. It's very, very, very unpleasant when the alarm clock goes off and you're not expecting it, you know. And it's a very traumatic period, I think, for a lot of Americans. I just, from talking to people, you know, those scenes at the Capitol were so shocking. But if there's a positive out of that, right, it is that it's not possible for anybody to be complacent anymore. There is a sense that you're living in a democracy which is endangered, and you have to know that. I suppose, secondly, in terms of this question of trying to form a single country or keep a single country going out of plurality, you know, I think there has to be a renewal of a narrative, you know. I think, and this again is not just an American problem, but it's a very wide democratic problem, right? Just that politics became very, very professionalized, you know. I think particularly from the 1980s onwards, you know, where it was a kind of a career, and people who were very, very adept and very good at it, and mostly lawyers, you know, becoming the kind of political figures. Whereas previously there'd been a wider sense of, you know, people came into politics from all sorts of different routes, and often from social movements, from labor movements, from, you know, from business, you know, from a whole range of kind of different entries. And that sort of professionalization of politics, I think, you know, has in an awful lot of the Western world, right, has produced this this lack of faith, this lack of trust in political systems and political cultures. You know, one of the ironies of our time, of course, is that people who are billionaires, like, or at least alleged billionaires like Donald Trump or whatever, can accuse other people of being in the elite. You know, the elite idea is being used as a contrast to, you know, I'm the real man of the people stuff. That's happened across a lot of the democratic world. But part of the problem is that politics did become, to a certain degree, an elite pursuit. And so one of the things we have to see in terms of this plurality, I think, is a feeding back in of new kinds of people coming into politics. And I'd be reasonably hopeful that that can happen in America. You know, there have been sort of really strong social movements, I think, who are getting involved and in voting rights and in, you know, all sorts of specific questions. And it's, the hope would have to be that those people can actually themselves and kind of move upwards through the political system. Social media, the huge question of the corrupting influence and the polarizing influence of social media has to be tackled. You know, if we didn't know how dangerous this is, we surely know by now. And introducing systems of accountability into how the main social media companies are run, I think, is a really urgent task for our time. You know, it really has to be done now, and it has to be done in the United States, because this is, as I said, where most of these companies are based. We need an economic commitment to, you know, to greater economic equality. If you look typically at, you know, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you know, there was a sense that most people had a stake in the economy, you know. And again, I'm not romanticizing this. Of course, there were people who were marginalized and left out, but it was reasonable to say that the ordinary person has a real stake in the economy and they will benefit from economic growth. And really, the last 20 years, we've seen this process around a lot of the developed world of the fruits of growth going more and more and more to the top 1%, and then to the top 1% of that 1%. You know, and that has to be dealt with. I mean, you know, and I'm sure a lot of you fundamentally disagree with me about this, but, you know, this is one of the things that governments has to tackle. You know, there have to be ways of feeding back the benefits of growth. One of the things I would say, and maybe I would say this because I'm involved in education, you know, but the route for people like me, working class people like me, you know, to be able to get better lives, you know, was always through education and being able to access third level education in particular. An awful lot of us, and I'm sure it's true of some of you, were the first people in your entire families ever to go to university or to go to college or whatever, you know. That didn't happen accidentally. I mean, that happened through policy. You know, it happened through the creation of systems that allowed it. And, you know, why was it possible for an ordinary person to go to college in the 1960s without building up vast amounts of debt? And it's not possible now. You know, is it that we're poorer now than we were in the 1960s? Not at all. There's an awful lot more wealth around. You know, we should be capable of affording everybody the opportunity to have access to the education that they want, and this is perfectly doable, I think. But it's also a kind of critical thing for democracy, because what we've increasingly done is use third level education as the gateway into decent jobs and into a sense of optimism and progress. And, you know, that's great if you get through that gate, but if you don't, you're locking huge numbers of people out of a sense of the future. And if we don't tackle that, then I think this polarization is only going to get worse. So a lot of these things are perfectly doable, and I think, you know, as an outsider, I think America has the energies and the resources and the goodwill and the capacities to actually do all of these things. The question is whether you can find an institutional form in which that kind of reflection and that kind of action become possible.
I'm not mute now, right? I'm going to want to say, not want to say goodbye, but before I do that, and I know we won't have time to discuss this, but as far as Afghanistan, the first thing that came to my mind when I thought about it is something else. Why are we in Vietnam? And Norman Mailer's book. And we can't discuss that now, but because it's too late. But I just wonder about these kinds of actions and trying to make a democracy out of places and that it's not in, first of all, I think you have to really want democracy to try to do it yourself. But anyway, there's lots more to talk about, so we'll just have you come back again. And thanks so much for being with us today.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.